Now, although you can create some simple macros at the moment, we're still having to run them by the very long method of opening up the macro list, which involves going to the developer ribbon, the macro list, choose the macro, and then run. That's 4 clicks, when really the macro itself is meant to be reducing the amount of mouse clicks that you're carrying out. So we need to look at various triggers. One possible trigger is a keyboard shortcut. Now you can assign keyboard shortcuts either when you set the macro up in the first place, or subsequently once the macro already exists. So if we take our sample macro file and look at creating a new macro, I'm going to call it type me. I'm going to store it in this workbook because we don't want to interfere with anything else. And then here I can assign a keyboard shortcut. Now the keyboard shortcut has to have control as the first character, but then you can have numbers or letters. Now the only problem is if you assign a keyboard shortcut that already exists, such as Ctrl S for save, then that keyboard shortcut is stolen from the normal action of saving and now carries out your macro. Because of that, I would suggest that you actually throw in the Shift key as well. So Control's given, you then hold down the Shift key and then a letter, for example R, and the keyboard shortcut becomes Ctrl Shift R. So I then say OK and go ahead with recording my macro. I'm going to turn relative referencing on and type into the cell that I'm currently on, which is E6, and not move anywhere, Guy. Return and stop. So now I can replay that macro simply by clicking into a cell and doing Ctrl Shift and R. My name appears. Ctrl Shift and R. Select another cell, Ctrl Shift R, and my name appears. Now one thing that we ought to point out, and hasn't really been pointed out to this stage, is that when a macro carries out commands, a number of commands or lots of commands, they are not undoable. You'll notice that undo is not available when you run a macro command, because the steps that it carries out are not listed in the undo history. Just something to be aware of. But by having a keyboard shortcut to fire the macro, we are already speeding up the process. But that's if you assign one when you start recording. Sometimes you just record the macro and then think, oh, I could do with a keyboard shortcut further down the line. We can add a keyboard shortcut later, so once the macro already exists, by going to the macro list, choosing the macro, for example, command sample, the one that already exists in this file, and then going to options. And you can see that this one has a keyboard shortcut of Ctrl, Shift, and S. If we delete the S, it reverts back to Ctrl plus, and then we can make it, let's say, Shift Z. OK. Cancel the macro box because we don't want to run anything, but that still saves the keyboard shortcut. Pick a cell, Ctrl, Shift Z, and this is the one that does today is whatever, and you are the best. But relatively a few to the right and a few down from where you start from. So that's a keyboard shortcut trigger. Probably the easiest trigger to create because it can be assigned at the start when you create your macro, or it can be assigned further down the line when the macro already exists.